All right, thank you. Thanks for sticking around for the last panel, and hello everyone in TV land. So thanks for being here for Adaptive Reuse, the final session of the day. I don't know if you guys are slide people. I'm a slide guy. We're all gonna do some slides for the presentation. It'll be a little different than the others, but try and keep it lively. So first off, hey, look, adaptive reuse, candidly, has been on the underwhelming side, I think, of expectations so far, given what we might have hoped in 2020 or 2021. So Pew and Gensler recently did a project together to look at whether buildings might convert better into dorm-style housing than regular apartments. So what you see on the screen is a co-living unit, smaller, 150 square feet instead of studio size of 440. And the reason for thinking about co-living is, well, office buildings usually have plumbing in the middle. Moving plumbing into every unit, very expensive. But college dorms often look more like modern office buildings than apartment buildings look like modern office buildings. Deeper, bigger floor plate, more people per floor, small units, and the plumbing can be in the middle, where it already is with an office. So we were very interested in whether using that model might enable adaptive reuse to work better than it is with regular apartments, where the cost per square foot has been prohibitively high, and the delivery has been on the low side of expectations. So cost benefits. Cost per unit is 2 to 4 times lower than either new build apartments or office to regular apartments, where the kitchen and the bathroom are inside the unit. That's a dramatic, dramatic cost difference. Centralizing plumbing is a big piece of it. Having the plumbing in the middle instead of in every unit. And you might say, I don't know, do people want to live like that? Well, it depends on the location. Depends what it costs. Is it safe? Is it clean? People live like this in college. And also, look, small, low-cost units, residential hotels, what were in the 20th century often called SROs, these were a 1/10 of the rental housing stock in major cities in the 20th century. Homelessness didn't explode in the US until the late 70s. We're only about 50 years from having almost no homelessness in the US. What changed? We lost our low-cost housing stock, mostly due to restrictive zoning codes and building codes. So maybe this could be a way to bring some of that back. Well, keeping the plumbing in the middle and using this model cuts construction costs per square foot by 25 to 35%, which is a game changer for enabling adaptive reuse. And maybe the numbers are a little too small on the slide, but the blue bars say about $400,000. That's a typical development cost for a new studio in the 3 cities we looked at for the first report, which were Denver, Minneapolis, and Seattle. The next 2 are going to be Los Angeles and Houston. That's coming out next month. So the development costs for a micro unit, adaptive reuse, downtown in these cities ranged from a low of $123 a unit in Denver versus $400 for a new build studio to $190 in Seattle versus $400 plus for a new build studio in Seattle. Dramatically lower cost per unit, changes the game versus doing regular adaptive reuse, where the cost for conversion is at least as high as it is with new builds and keeps housing downtown. So with those lower development costs, rents can be lower too. We're looking at rents, projected rents, that would be about half of the median in those markets. So that means affordability in the 30 to 40% AMI range, $850 in Denver, $750 in Minneapolis, $1,000 in Seattle, including utilities. So a way of enabling deeply affordable housing, but with much lower subsidies than are being used today for subsidized housing. So in Denver, where that new build studio would be $400,000 a door to build, the net operating income justifies about $100,000 in private sector investment from that building. That means you've got a financing gap of $300,000 per unit. You just can't get that many units to market with existing subsidy dollars. But with this model, it still justifies about $100K in private sector investment because the net operating income but it's only 123 to build. So the financing gap is only 23 a unit. So in Denver, which was the best city so far, finance-wise, that means you can get about 12 to 13 times as many units with the same subsidy dollars, at the same affordability level, and they can be better located. With that, let me hand it over to Kelly.
Thank you. So my name is Kelly Farrell. Really thrilled when Alex asked our team to get involved with the project. We at Gensler were architects, designers, strategists. That's what we do. And we're also believers in an abundant housing model. And really, essentially, that you have to provide the right range of housing with the right range of services for the right people at the right time in their life. Housing isn't static. In the way we experience it, it's actually quite fluid. And when we look at where the housing market is today, it's really horrifying that over half of renters spend 30% of their income. When I graduated from college, the gold standard was 20%. I'm old now, so that was a long time ago. That a quarter of renters are spending 50% of their income on rent. And that's not just I can't afford housing, it's actually a larger social crisis. It means I'm not taking care of my health. It means I have no retirement savings. It means I have a life that is going to be hampered because I need a place to live. We're also seeing massive demographic changes going on, where we have an all-time low in household size, 2.49 people per household. Renter households are predominantly one person. And they have been for quite a while. You know, if you come see the market rate side of our business, and we work across the whole spectrum, everything from permanent supportive to transitional to market to really high-end housing. When it comes to rental housing, the target is still there for a single, not for a family. So that demand side isn't stopping, and those numbers go up. If you look at Seattle, it's almost 58%. And then it's compounded by where we are with office vacancy. And whether people are returning to the office or not is the question. The question is, what type of office are they returning to? And they're generally returning to higher amenitized buildings, which leads us a whole building stock from largely the 60s, 70s, and 80s that's now considered obsolete. And we see those vacant buildings all over town. So when we got into the design work with this with Alex and his team, we really looked at kind of 3 case studies. And these are actual floor plans of buildings. And they're kind of typical of the era. They're really deep. And what it allows us to do is to not only put the unit that Alex just showed you, that smaller single room occupancy unit, on the floor, but provide the right services and amenities so that people can live together well. A lot of people who are actually singles are looking for community in their living arrangement, whether it's in their neighborhood or in their building. So we used a lot of the design logic that we use in education in creating vertical neighborhoods. If you go to a university dorm, if we were to walk around campus, what you'll probably find is most key fobs give you access to your floor, not the entire building. Because the goal is not for you to run amok around the whole place, but the goal is for you to end up in the neighborhood that you belong in. So when you look at these floor plans and you see the ring of units on the outside, what you see on the inside is really a place for community gathering. And we see that this product can do a lot, quite frankly. It helps put people back into downtowns and get foot traffic up on the streets. Climate friendly, if you have carbon goals, converting office buildings rather than figuring out how to do new ground up housing, massive carbon impacts that we can take advantage of. And we think that there's a market on the tenant side that's really strong. It's everything from combating homelessness to new arrivals. I just got to town, I just took a job. I don't know where I want to live yet because I don't know how the city works. I don't know which neighborhood is going to be a great long-term suit for me. Seniors, veterans, we see this as an option for a lot of people to have a great housing experience and a great living experience. Alex already said this, but it does stretch the subsidy dollar a lot further. And we also know that most of the areas where these office buildings are, they're already well amenitized. Food, education, libraries, all the things, oops, and the computer's going to restart. That's very exciting. But all the things, all the infrastructure things that make somebody's experience great from an urban level, they're already there. They were there for a whole population of people that used to come in around 8 and leave around 5. And now they're going to get a new life 18 hours a day. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nick.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I'm Nick Norris. I'm the planning director for Salt Lake City. And I'm going to share some of the work we've done from a policy standpoint on adaptive reuse and supporting that. And so we have this motto in our office that if you want to make it easy,
photograph that for
don't put things in the way that are just to put things in the way, right? We also have a very simplistic look on what zoning can and should be doing and how it should be used, because we feel like it's kind of gone off the rails over the last 20 or 30 years. And so everything we do, we look at through this lens. And so when we're looking at adaptive reuse, and all these pictures are images of projects that are underway in Salt Lake City or just finished. So regulations will get in the way of reusing existing buildings. And so some of the questions that we ask ourselves is the regulation necessary? Are our parking requirements so high in this area that it's preventing that change of use from occurring? Does the regulation support change? Is there processes involved? Is it cumbersome? Is it going to be really long? And then also, what incentives do we need to use? And I will say, I think every adaptive reuse needs some incentive, whether that's streamlined processes, financial, extra development potential, et cetera. There's likely going to have to be some kind of an incentive involved. So this building and the pictures, kind of the before and then during, one of the things I really want to point out about this building is that width of that floor plate. It's a medical office building, central corridor. It's perfect for being converted to residential. Getting back to some of the zoning rules that are necessary, these are two different projects, but also demonstrate one thing. That bottom right picture is in a commercial zone. And there's many zoning codes that don't allow residential uses in commercial zones. In Salt Lake City for decades now, we've allowed residential uses there so that we can have these types of things. But other things that come into play are sometimes for multifamily types of development, there's minimum lot widths or minimum lot areas per dwelling unit. All of those things prevent or may prevent a building from being reused at higher densities or for different uses. Similarly with lot coverages and floor area ratios. If you don't know, a floor area ratio is how much floor area you can build given the square footage of a lot. Lots of cities use either of those as metrics. I mentioned parking already. And then the big thing is our addition's easy. So this top picture is actually a local landmark building that had to go through our Historic Landmarks Commission for approval. But we have policies in place and design guidelines in place to ensure that our treasured buildings can be adapted over time, knowing that it's not necessarily about preserving every aspect of that site, but that there should be some change so that those buildings remain viable. They're far more likely to be preserved if they have more viable uses and more viable opportunities. And you can tell this big piece of property next to it was essentially a parking lot. The next thing is it easy to change the use? Again, these are some of those same barriers, but sometimes specific uses have specific types of regulations. You can only do this use if type of things. And we've systematically been removing those types of barriers from our zoning code. For example, this building in downtown, I think it's our largest adaptive reuse that's underway, an old office building being converted to residential. That up until a few years ago had a minimum parking requirement that worked for office, didn't meet the residential requirement. And so we actually eliminated our minimum parking requirements, and not just downtown, but near all of our transit as well. There's also different types of things like design standards or access and service areas. Minimum dwelling sizes all are commonly found in codes that make it really hard to reuse some of these buildings. And I think those floor plate examples were a really great example of what's possible. And if a city had a minimum floor plate requirement of 400 square feet, none of that stuff is going to matter, and you couldn't do it. And so we recently adopted some adaptive reuse incentives in our city that waive a lot of those requirements. They waive a lot of use requirements. They waive a lot of parking, a lot of density requirements. These are 3 different projects that exemplify how those types of development incentives could work. So the top left corner is a building there. We actually allowed more height. So they preserved most of the ground floor and bumped up to add residential uses. And now it's become kind of a centerpiece in an area that's full of local businesses, and now starting to have the densities to support those. The middle picture is actually a 5-minute walk from here, and probably one of the more unique adaptive reuse projects that I think I've seen. So this is again, another historic property, an old LDS church right across the street from the campus of the University of Utah that is now apartments. It's kind of hard to see in that nighttime picture, but this was something that was made possible because we didn't require parking. This old church was built prior to any parking regulations, and so a change of use would require those new parking standards. If we had a parking requirement that applied, this building likely would have been demolished. And for those of you who are either familiar with Salt Lake City or live here, you know that we have pretty significant air quality issues. And building demolition is one of those things that contributes significantly to that. Construction in general does. And so we want to support preserving as many of these buildings as we can, not just because there's the cultural value of that, there's the potential for lower cost housing, but there's also an environmental benefit for us doing that as well. And then on the right-hand side is, that's a before and after, top and bottom, but we have some infill regulations that allow oversized side yards, rear yards, et cetera, to be converted to housing in new builds if you're preserving that existing building. So the bottom right, that existing house that you can kind of make out behind the trees in the top picture is on the right. There's a new single-family home to the left of it with a common walkway that goes back to 3 townhomes. And so this is a 7,000 square foot lot. And we went from 1 dwelling to 5 dwellings on it. And the only incentive we needed was to remove some of those zoning regulations. It's also around half a block from a transit station, which some of our transit stations in Salt Lake City are in low density neighborhoods. And so this is a way that we can get density near that public investment that goes into transit, which is significant. And that's it. I'm gonna turn it over to Chris.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Chris. I work with 3 organizations. Give Communities does primarily non-economic needed developments within Utah, shelters, permanent supportive housing, churches, schools, those sort of things. Give Development does beneficial projects that are impact focused but do provide a return. It then uses that return to fund the overhead of Give Communities and Perpetual Housing Fund, which is a relatively recent organization built out of COVID. On some of our western states that have been on the coast for a while, your sort of housing issues caught up to Utah pretty strongly in the last 2 or 3 years. Now the average Salt Lake median family can afford precisely 0 houses in Salt Lake. And so Perpetual Housing Fund tries to reconnect what used to be fairly common, your house being the thing that might help you retire or put your kids through college, in a world where buying a home is no longer attainable. So its bread and butter kind of project would be an apartment complex that shares 75% more or less of all the revenues of that complex annually when it goes to refinance, when it goes to sell, with the tenants themselves, allowing them to build nest eggs without necessarily having to have that on-ramp to getting a mortgage. Done a couple projects fairly close. I saw this one of your slides. This is a few blocks from here. And one of the things I'd like to say is how do we take a building and make it housing, which is a great question to ask. When we've seen some of these projects and you are trying to do traditional housing rather than co-living, which is a great use for a lot of these office complexes, so often it's what else can you do? Not just with the building, but with other assets the building might have. And so this was a medical office complex in a fairly low density neighborhood that probably if you were to ask them, hey, I want to build an apartment complex, would have told you somewhat politely, no, we'd rather not have that here. But because the structure already pre-exists, the massing of it, the sort of familiarity of the structure, I think allows people to relatively support other uses with the building. And so what unlocked this for housing was really that we could take the overall massing of it and add something to the side of it as well. So you had this parking structure to the right of it that was supporting some surface parking for the building. The beauty of moving from a 60s to 80s office complex is typically these were built with 3 or 4 parking stalls per 1,000 square feet. Moving to a residential use, even a traditional residential use, is going to be more like 1 or 2 per 1,000. And so this building in the back took a surface parking lot and made it a micro park, and then took some of the stuff on this street facade and made it additional housing in a way that doesn't overpower the neighborhood. It's kind of a nice transition from a taller building to more lower density structures. Importantly though, as Nick was mentioning, the thing that unlocked this apart from the latent land value around the perimeter was this difference in how density was imagined. The city, I'm not saying you did this on purpose, but used the excuse of an existing structure in order to say, look, the building exists, whatever is reasonable to put as far as humans in that building, we're gonna be okay with, rather than having a mandatory X amount of square feet that you have to have per unit. That allowed this structure to support the amount of density that allowed us to do a full retrofit of the old building and build on the side. So having your zoning codes, whether at the state or local level, modify for these existing structures is really the number one thing you can do to make them have beneficial use. And then allowing the surrounding perimeter of said structures to be used in maybe an atypical way will make it incentivized enough for developers to go ahead and pick up and do these sort of things, which maybe is an answer to a question that we heard a little bit earlier. I mean, how can you have the market incentivized to provide lower cost product? The market actually has a really good incentive to do that. The reason the market typically doesn't build lower cost single family homes, for instance, is if I have a lot and the only thing I can do with it is build a home on that lot, my incentive is to build as big of a house as possible so that I can sell as many square feet as possible and make as much money. But if that same lot allows me to build as many as I'd like, the developer's natural incentive is going to put as many units as possible on that same lot, and therefore those units will compress, they'll become smaller, and then become more affordable. And so what happened here natural, this is an affordable housing project. It serves primarily families. It's about half family units, half single units, from 25 to 55% AMI. But the same logic, if this were a market rate project, would hold. The city allowing kind of a carte blanche on density for whatever made sense with the building is what allowed this structure to proceed. This structure is a little bit further away. It's about 2 miles away. A lot of cities and states have this structure, in their units. It's a very handsome thing. Similarly, this is going to be a project that has partial conversion to residential. And that's really what's unlocking its point of view. You have this handsome structure, and here's kind of how it exists, or at least did exist about a year ago. I've got an office tower, and I've got a bunch of attendant parking. 6 stories of parking. I needed 600 units of parking for this office tower on the right. And that's more or less how it would have to stay. As of right now, the parking structure is a little aged, and if you're able to put housing in top of it, or inside of it, your parking demand, again, goes significantly smaller. What that unlocked on this project is the ability to make that parking garage only 3 stories and completely subterranean, and utilize another basically building plot. Had I tried to go in Salt Lake City and buy a mid-rise parcel for building a new structure on it, probably would have cost between $6 and $12 million, depending on the items of it. We bought this building for $30 million in the beginning. $6 million is not an insignificant change, and that really is what allowed this structure to go to housing. The other thing that we're doing is, just because the building isn't needed in the housing stock completely for commercial doesn't mean that it shouldn't somewhat be commercial. So the top floor of this building is 3 stories of beneficial co-work space. So this will be kind of like we work for nonprofits. You've got some residential in the middle, and then we have large daycare and school on the bottom. We've got a nonprofit restaurant. Green Bike, some states have different bike sharing programs. In Utah, it's called Green Bike, is moving their headquarters to the bottom. And because the commercial use parks at different times of day as the residential use, we are allowed to have much less of this structure go to parking. And the blue actually further made the yellow possible. So again, as you're looking at these structures, what zoning allowed us to do in this condition was this particular parcel was actually downzoned in the 70s, as many were, 70s and 80s. We had these tall structures. For whatever reason, neighborhoods decided that they'd like a little bit less of that. And so you could not have built more than a 4 or a 5-story building in this zone by right when we went ahead into this project. But again, the excuse of the existing structure is what allowed Salt Lake City to contemplate an inline addition, something that's, hey, we've already got a building, we're gonna build something of that scale or mass, and that made this project feasible. So the zoning flexibility in both these cases and the ability to really look at parking garages in a different way is what, for at least traditional affordable housing, made these both work. And that's it. I just figured we'd end on a pretty slide.
All right. I have a couple questions for the panel, but also wanted to flag, I probably should have said at the outset, if you would like the slides, they're yours, at least for mine and Kelly's.
Yes.
Nick and Chris, is that true
Yep,
for you guys?
absolutely.
Sure. All right, so if you like the slides, you can have them, just ask for an email and we'll send them your way. Question for Kelly, where are we with adaptive reuse on scale? Like what cities are doing well? How many units are coming to market? Who's having success? Why?
Yeah, so I always remind people adaptive reuse isn't new. We just have a whole lot of new stuff to play with in adaptive reuse. So we've got offices in 57 cities. We are the busiest in places like New York. New York, we have 6,000 units that we're converting office to residential in. We're taking down 1 million square foot campuses. And frankly, because their policies are about getting that conversion done faster. They also allow us to do things much like your example, Chris, where if we had demoed the building and started from scratch, we'd never be able to achieve the density again. So there's real incentive to make them happen. Places where the office market has been upside down for a while, they're slow to start because the basis in those buildings is so high that there's no money left to convert it, right? And the rent doesn't deliver. So typically, if you've got a low basis in a building, which is somebody who's got a long-term hold, who wants to give it new life, or you've got a city or public agency that is saying, hey, actually, we no longer need this space, and we want to contribute to solve the housing problem, we're seeing those projects move faster. And just as a point of scale, I think in the last 18 months, we have looked at over 3,500 buildings to convert from office to residential. And so we can do everything from a squint test. I will tell you, most of our people will go, yeah, like that's a winner. It's also about what you're converting it to. And what we really like about the study that we did with Alex at Pew is it took a lot of buildings that otherwise wouldn't have made sense for conversion. They're too deep. Like at just some point, it's dark inside. They took buildings that otherwise were like, well, I wouldn't make this luxury condos, I wouldn't make this high-end market housing, but man, would I take a co-living model, because all of a sudden that deep space in the middle is a real asset I can use and start to design a really great experience for someone's every single day to happen there. Yes, it will unlock more of them.
Nick, Salt Lake City has an unusually strong, kind of a forward-thinking adaptive reuse ordinance. What's in it?
Well, I kind of touched on a lot of it, but we have a tiered system. So for the buildings that have the most historic value, we're way more flexible. So you can change it to almost any use. We have a list of maybe a dozen uses that we won't allow in landmark buildings just because they're super impactful, right? And they probably don't work with historic buildings. And then we also have a different tier that applies to any building over 50 years in age. So it's also changes every year, right? New buildings become eligible. And on those properties, you also can, and you can do this on some of the more important historic buildings too, but you can actually build additional structures and you get things like height bonuses. And so we've made the policy decision that we're okay with taller buildings next to our small historic buildings because of the value that we think that, we've just made that a value decision. And so things like in some zones, you could build an additional 3 to 4 stories above what the zoning normally would allow. And so if you're in a zone that allows, 50, 60 feet of building height, suddenly you can get up to 75, 80 feet, which really makes a lot of projects feasible. And then we waive a lot of things, like we reduce the parking requirement in zones that have one. Sometimes we waive design guidelines and standards. We allow other building types that may not be allowed in that zone. So if you're in a low density zoning district, maybe you can do townhomes types of things. So that's kind of the gist of it. We're actually looking at expanding that just by right. So it's not even an adaptive reuse type of benefit anymore. It's just which several cities have done. But that one image I showed you is showing us that, we can do that. We have space, our lots. For those that don't know, Salt Lake City is fairly unique. And I mean, you've experienced our streets just from being here. Super wide streets. We also have massive blocks. And so what happens is that means our lots are like 300 feet deep. So there's a lot of unused space behind our buildings in this city where we can see things realized. And it's almost like we're an infill city, but it's almost like that's new development potential that hasn't been thought of, mainly because it probably hasn't been needed until the last 15 years.
Chris, Kelly mentioned at the outset that housing costs are at an all-time high for share of household budget. We also see that transportation costs are creeping up for households each year. We heard a little bit yesterday about traffic as an issue here, and also from Governor Cox about loneliness today. How do you see adaptive reuse fitting in helping with letting people be closer to the places they go every day, and helping make a dent in some of the problems like transportation costs, traffic, but also loneliness?
Well, I think it's just that. Interestingly, there was a study that came out a decade ago, I guess 12 years ago, that a lot of people took and ran with about happiness relative to income. And the headline that every paper ran with is over $70,000, you don't get happier if you make more money. That number's inflated a bit these days. It's probably more like 110 or 120 here. The buried lead in that article, though, was there was something like a 1-to-1 correlative effect between how much money you made and how happy you were up until that point. But there was a 7-to-1 ratio on how you answered the question, do you feel alone? It actually is more important than how much money you make. And our properties, specifically, and I've built some of these properties, as you look at a regular apartment complex, it is very much designed for you to get to your unit as quickly as possible, meet as few of your neighbors as possible, have your sanctuary, and then go to work where you have another little pocket that you're kind of insulated within. And I think having these sort of mixed use, mixed neighborhoods, especially if you're in a traditional, say an office park, everyone's seen this surface parked bunch of office buildings around. That is a complete dead space half of the day. And it's depressing if you're the last one to leave the office. Humans shouldn't be here. You get that feeling. If you're leaving at 7 p.m., it's a little dark, it's a little creepy. All of that surface parking could absolutely be building lots for some sort of multifamily or any sort of moderate density housing that would make the office more successful. You would have an interest in being in that office if you happen to live next to that office, or if you had enough density to support retail within that neighborhood because you had walkability. You saw this a lot with malls over the last 10 or 15 years. You had these single-use entities with massive parking lots, and through the nation you're seeing these kind of become these sort of spokes of overall cities because they're coordinating those two things. Office really is this times shopping mall, in that you could have much better health impacts, and you could do it economically in a way that just the building on its own is never going to get you.
I have a few more questions, but I'm only going to ask one of them before we open it up to everyone for questions. So, right, Salt Lake City's kind of been out in front on adaptive reuse and making it easier to build and convert. We've seen several states step in the last couple sessions to facilitate adaptive reuse because their jurisdictions candidly haven't taken the kind of steps, right, that Salt Lake City has. So Washington this past session legalized micro units, so the sort of co-living units we're talking about, anywhere that multifamily is allowed. Oregon did too. Hawaii explicitly said for adaptive reuse, jurisdictions may not make their requirements more onerous than the International Building Code. And couldn't be a game changer because that enables major simplicity in terms of design flexibility, window operability, unit size. We're also seeing some states consider tax incentives, even for market rate housing, to facilitate adaptive reuse. What are some steps that you think are most promising that states can take to make it easier for adaptive reuse to take place if they want to get more of it to happen, but it hasn't yet?
You want to start? I'll follow. I was like, we could be here for another hour.
Well, I think some of those things that other states have taken are pretty good steps. Like, relying, the building codes are intended for that health and safety purpose, right? And so, do you really need to add additional zoning regulations onto that? And so I think, that is a big step. I think it helps with the occupancy. A lot of cities will have like the limitations on how many people can live in a dwelling that frankly is unreasonable. And Salt Lake City's that's one of those we haven't cracked. Colorado just cracked that as statewide. But I would look at those kinds of things, those things that what defines a family this day and age is not what it was 10 years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so when you have those kinds of limitations, those are universal to a state. They're not just a Salt Lake City or a Sandy or an Orem or a St. George issue. They are universal. So I think that's like one of those things that can really start to unlock a lot of unused housing that already exists. And it may even start to flip some of those properties that are used for short-term rentals. They may have more incentive now to rely on a more steady income, especially as that kind of ebbs and flows in occupancy.
And just for those who aren't familiar with what Nick said, a lot of jurisdictions have laws that say only 2, 3, or 4 unrelated people are allowed to live in a home, but an unlimited number of related people are allowed to live in a home. And we have a record number of empty bedrooms in the US, but they can't be rented to roommates, even if the landlord would like to and people would like to live there. That's not allowed because of local laws restricting unrelated people from living together. And so the reforms are sometimes called Golden Girls laws to allow people to live together who are unrelated, and several states have passed them, including Colorado, Oregon, and Iowa.
Which I think makes him, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, which completely makes sense. I mean, those who have grown up in a family with more than one sibling know that the absolute worst person you can have move next to you is a 5-year-old. They're 100% terrorists. They're going to ruin your property. They're going to ruin your neighbor's property. The fear about parking maybe is somewhat legitimate as far as making sure people are parked and not on the street. But generally speaking, like, these were built for humans that were far more objectionable than someone who wants to move in with their buddy in order to buy a house. To echo Nick's comments, I'd just say, first, do no harm. To the extent there's anything in your code that is actively preventing reuse or actively preventing housing, ask why. And if the reason it was in there is more important than the housing crisis is currently today. Once you get there, I think activating specialized zoning reforms that allow you to do something with surrounding land that you couldn't have done as kind of a carrot for you to take these old buildings and reuse them, I think will have great success.
Yeah, I'll add in, I love Nick's slide, if you want something, make it easy. Start with any entitlement process that you have. if you are putting someone through 2 to 3 to 4 to 6 years of entitlement to do housing, you're asking for a different pain point than a lot of people are willing to do. So start at the beginning, get the barrier to entry down, because we will see more developers come forward to say, yeah, I can go put in a 2-year investment in entitling and build, and especially for conversions. You know, one of the most interesting things about the model that we shared with you guys today is that's a 12-month, maybe 18-month conversion max. It's not 24 to 36 months. And when we think about people needing housing and where we are in the crisis, anything we can do to take those just fundamental barriers away, because what they are is they're dollars and time. Like we generally end up about the same place, but we spend a lot of dollars and time getting there that diverts capital away from funding other projects.
Let's open up to the audience for questions. There's a floating mic. I have some more also, but you guys go first. Ahmad?
Thank you for the presentation. Ahmad Abu Khalaf with Enterprise Community Partners. I'm curious to know if you've seen models that are similar to what we have seen with publicly owned land or land owned by mission-based organizations where they donate or offer the land at a discounted price to incentivize or help with the creation of affordable housing. Have you seen a separate but similar model with like vacant office buildings owned by public entities or mission-based organizations where they sell or lease the property at a discounted price to help convert it to affordable housing?
I don't want to take that. I can take it. We're seeing a lot of mission-based, really, they've got incredible parking assets, incredible amounts of land sitting to park cars on one level. And so the projects that our firm is involved in that realm, they're ground up. We're not seeing as much kind of secondary assets in terms of, I've also got a whole huge administration space. The biggest space we see kind of going is, frankly, a lot of schools that no longer operate. We're seeing those as an avenue for conversions.
I think the building on the screen, actually, we partnered with a really interesting organization called the Rocky Mountain Homes Fund, who effectively gives, they partner with people to buy houses, is maybe the 10-second version. It's more complex than that. Because we had land basis of 0, we were able to more or less contribute that and build for sale product, condos that would be significantly less to buy because this building had been utilized by another nonprofit. And so I think it's fairly common. Where it's allowed, you're seeing churches do this as well. Mm-hmm. Churches have probably the least intensive parking use you might imagine, maybe stadiums. But generally speaking, one for 3 hours once a week, you have this parking demand, and you see a lot of these parking lots. You also have usually a sympathetic partner in a religious institution, and so we've seen some good examples of that in addition to schools. I think schools are the easiest.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question for you, Kelly. So, we at Alexis Posey from HUD, we have. The administration has looked at the issue of adaptive reuse and had several convenings and gatherings around it. At HUD, we're very interested in it as well. You can use, local municipalities can use their CDBG funds. That is one of the uses that you can for housing with those funds. One question that I have is, one of the comments that we had always heard back was, as you mentioned, around sort of the properties that have traded hands, right, and the valuations, and that the valuations were still too high to basically incentivize the conversions. So wanted to see if you're starting to see those property owners right now come to the table, right? Are the valuations being reset to a level that makes sense for them to look more at this? And then secondarily, when you think about the other issue that we had heard was the tenancies, right? So you may have a building maybe 70% vacant, but it's that last 30% that is just not cost effective to be able to make the building 100% vacant to do the adaptive reuse. So just any feedback that you have on that? Yeah, let me take the first one first, which is, are we seeing more properties move?
When we started looking at office to residential conversions, we had owners who realized that their tenants weren't coming back, or not enough of them. And they would call and we would tell them what we thought it would take to get it done. And then we would always grab a contractor and say, and by the way, this is probably what it will cost. And they would say, thank you so much. You don't need to call us back. We're good. We'll wait for the tenants to come back. Then we started getting banks calling and saying, hey, I have these office buildings I own now. I've got to figure out how to sell them. What do you think I can do with them? And we would say, okay, kind of same information that we gave the last guy who called, but man, there's a path. And they would say, ooh, that's not quite enough. And we'll happily call you if we find someone. Now we're starting to find people who have transacted on the buildings and who are buying them. And they're calling saying, I bought it at this price point because I know I can convert it now. So let's get started with the work. And I think that's the biggest shift we're seeing in the pipeline is that a lot of this, 60s through 90s product, it's not the product that people are wooing their people back to the office with. And so owners have taken a hard look, and now we've got a whole group of people in development who are saying, yeah, I can make this into something, I can give it economic and social and cultural life again. And then the second part of your question.
About the tenancy, right? If you have a 7% building and the last 30%, that was something that we've heard a lot about.
Yes, so being alone goes the same thing for tenants. They don't want to be alone in the building either. And we're seeing a lot of owners get creative with, one, either consolidating that tenancy, or two, a lot of office holders hold multiple properties. And so going back to that tenancy and saying, hey, how about I upgrade your space and relocate you because I can put TI dollars into this building. I can't put them into the building you're in anymore. And we're seeing that as a path. The great thing about office buildings, frankly, is their floor-to-floor heights when it comes to conversions. And so if you do find yourself in a situation where you need to consolidate a group of tenants, you've got all the vertical space you need to do the plumbing offsets. You've just got to manage their expectations during the conversion of the building.
I'll also say acquisition costs and construction costs work in tandem.
Yep.
So if your acquisition costs are a little higher, but your construction costs are a little lower, that can work. If your construction costs are going to be really high, your acquisition costs have to get really low because these are all just costs. Do the windows have to open in the building? Most modern office buildings have inoperable windows, right? Those are safe. The windows don't open to the Four Seasons, right? I mean, but there are these requirements that windows have to open, which most jurisdictions have, but not all. Can you have mechanical ventilation and HEPA filters? That's perfectly safe, but if you have to convert inoperable windows to operable ones, that's a huge cost. At that point, your acquisition cost has to be a lot lower for the building. Can you use scissor stairs? A lot of office buildings have scissor stairs, 2 staircases that are near each other because that was the style. Those are perfectly safe if they're non-combustible materials and it's sprinklered. That's perfectly safe, but modern codes usually don't allow them. Do you have to convert the scissor stairs into 2 separate staircases? Or are you allowed to use them together? And if you're allowed to do those things, then acquisition costs can be a little higher and that's okay. If not, and you have to do all of those construction costs, incur them, even though they don't add with the life safety, at that point your acquisition costs have to be awfully low.
Yeah, Alex, one other point that you're just making me think of when we said about what makes it work, knowing what your building department's going to ask for and knowing what you're allowed to rely on, that's very often the difference between someone transacting on the property to convert it and not. In a new build, you know the building code you're up against, or collaborating with would be the optimist way of saying that. You know the building code that you're working with. You know the outcome. Inspection knows what to do. Plan checkers know what to do. If you think about a conversion, your building department is getting hit with product from the 50s, 60s, 70s. And I think a lot of us know this, but the building code, I live in the city of Los Angeles, and the building code in the city of Los Angeles in the 50s was 25 pages. It's 22 volumes, and they're all about 3 inches wide. And they get more complex every year. So that building that was built in 1950 never anticipated the level of complexity that we talk about today. And there's I think a reasonableness conversation and what do you rely on, and cities who are getting ahead of the conversation and communities that are getting ahead of the conversation are taking a look at their building stock and saying, wow, we've got to be able to address structures that were built in the 50s and 60s and what we're going to require so that when people have the opportunity, they have intelligence about the product married with that opportunity. And then all the luck in the world happens because we know what we're doing.
We have time for a final question.
Can you speak really quickly to constraints on existing infrastructure that might occur when a building goes from an office space to somewhere where people are showering, flushing toilets, and cooking all around the clock?
Do you want me to take that one? You guys want to take it?
Go for it.
Yes, there's more. The short answer is generally you need to look at your mains coming into the building. Typically, your electrical loads, depending on how you position what level of cooking equipment you require, they're not catastrophic because you probably had a lot of computers and other things sucking power all day long. It's usually water that we look at and waste, and what we're doing, what we need to add to the building, and then frankly, what connections happen at the city main.
I'd add it's also different based on that context. So adaptive reuse in smaller buildings and neighborhoods. This gets back to that demographic that, we have our smallest household size that we've ever had. And so a lot of our neighborhoods, at least in Salt Lake City, were built when the average family size, we're Utah, we've got bigger families than most of the rest of the nation, and historically have. But we have neighborhoods that the sewer and water were built when we had 5 or 6 people per household. Now that we're down in Salt Lake, we're at 2.1. So, we can fit, if you took a neighborhood of 100 homes and suddenly there's 300 less people living there, that's much less load that's actually going into these systems, especially with modern appliances and things like shower heads and updated, building codes that deal with all those kinds of things. And so in our neighborhoods, we're able to infill without having to upgrade the city systems. In our big areas, downtown, a neighborhood where we're seeing a ton of growth is called Sugar House. We are in the middle of upgrading capacity in all of those systems, and it is expensive. Downtown, for example, we've had a 2-year project because we have to go underneath existing light rail, and utilities do not work under existing light rail. And so all of those kinds of things add up. But, fortunately, most cities have really good public utility departments that actually plan ahead and have the various funding mechanisms already planned out 30 or 40 years ahead.
I would echo that. The building that's up right now actually moved from naturally gas heated and cooled to a fully electric building. Both structures will be emission free because that's where we live. And even with doing that and having 100% of the building's load, we actually reduced our overall electrical demand on the project. We put 1 new sewer line and 1 new water line in.
Great, thanks to our panel, and let me hand it back over to Lauren.